So a few years ago, I was at an interreligious ceremony with a bunch of people from Waverly, UCC. So our sibling church over closer to like Division and 33rd or so. And it was a beautiful ceremony. I don't know, some of you may have been there or not. But we got to see and hear from a lot of our different religious community neighbors. One of them were Sikhs. And this was after a lot of us came together to advocate for the fair treatment and the release of asylum seekers that were being unconstitutionally held at Sheridan Federal Correctional Institute. Among them, Sikhs from India who were being forced to eat food that go against their dietary code. So this was a really significant service for us, and they brought this beautiful musical gift. It was unlike anything most of us had heard, and it was really compelling. And then afterward, we got to have dinner together. All of these different communities. I think it might have been at First Congregational Church. I can't remember off the top of my head. And one of our teens from Waverly were just enamored with the Sikh table members, table guests, the other folks at the table we were sitting with. They're just enamored with the turbans that they were wearing. And she asks, "Hey, why are you wearing those funny hats?" And the rest of us from Waverly were like, "Oh no, you're not supposed to ask things like that. That's rude." And the woman next to her smiled. It was like, "Well, we wear these turbans because in our culture, our homeland culture, kings wear turbans. And in our tradition, we're all kings. The king is not higher than we are." She said, "Well, but I noticed that some of the girls are wearing turbans too." I'm like, "Yeah, all of us. We all wear the turbans. Nobody is above us. We're on the same playing field." I love that so much. Today is Pentecost Sunday, which is a holiday recognized in the church calendar every 50 days after Easter. Usually during Pentecost, we remember a couple of different things. First, it's often seen as like the birthday for the church. And it's also often seen as when followers of Jesus received the Holy Spirit. Last year, we went through the book of Acts, and we touched on how the book of Acts talks about this event. And for that book, this is like a twofer. It covers both of these things happening. It's this really wild, chaotic story. You've got followers of Jesus. They're trying to come to terms with like Jesus is resurrected, and he spent some time with them, and then he goes up to heaven, and they're sitting in a room praying with each other, trying to figure out, well, what do we do now? Where do we go from here? And then the Holy Spirit rips into the house that they're staying in this dramatic display of fire and wind, and flames are on each person's head, and then they're compelled to leave this house and go out throughout the city of Jerusalem during holiday season. So you've got folks from all over the known world at the time there, and these people start speaking to them, start preaching to them in languages that they've never spoken, but the folks, the visitors from all over the world have. It's their languages. And then hundreds of people end up getting baptized. It's such a crazy scene that many folks are like, "Why are all of you drunk? This is wild to me." And they're like, "We're not drunk, it's 9 a.m. And I know for some of us, we'd be like, "Hey." Brunch mimosas are a thing. Now, yeah. But in the book of John, we don't get a scene like this. This is our last Sunday in the book of John. And here we do get a story of how God's Spirit is shared amongst the community. But it happens to be with Jesus entering a house that people are hiding in, hunkering down in. The followers of Jesus are there. We've talked about this passage in the last few weeks. Jesus appears out of nowhere and goes, "Peace be with you," which would be a little scary for me. Yeah. But it's, hey, we're good. And also this is my hope for us. Peace. This is what we're about. Wellness, holistic wellness. And then breathes out God's Spirit onto all of them. You just picture Jesus there. And that's the scene. That's it. It's this strange but kind of cozy, intimate scene. Since this is our last Sunday in the book of John, I've been kind of looking forward to talking about not only how this whole thing wraps up, but also kind of where some of this starts. You might have picked up that throughout this series, I've mentioned that Jesus really is being portrayed as an avatar of God here. Jesus carries the Logos of God. Jesus carries the Spirit of God. Jesus represents God. And one of John's whole points in this book is, we don't get to talk with God face to face, but if you look at Jesus, you get an idea of what Jesus cares about and what God cares about, what Jesus's values are, and by extension, what God's values are. And all of this kind of depends on John's understanding of the Holy Spirit. This is before we start getting Trinitarian theology. That comes later. But you can see some of the building blocks of it here. And John pulls a lot from this Greek Jewish philosopher at the time called Philo of Alexandria, who lived in an overlapping time period with Jesus, and also loves to pull back from the Hebrew Bible scriptures. So that's part of what we're going to do. I want to tell a story of this evolving idea of the Spirit. And trust me, if Spirit's theology stuff is not your bailiwick, if this has never kept you up at night, don't worry. Don't worry. This is working towards something, okay? So stay with me. In the Hebrew Bible, we get the book of Genesis. John loves to reference this book. He starts off with "in the beginning," and he talks about God bringing the world into motion. Well, in the book of Genesis, we get this word, ruach. That's the word for spirit, which is also the word for wind, which is also the word for breath, and is the word for air. It's a multifaceted word. Yeah. And so when we meet God in the first chapter of the book of Genesis, before anything is created, God is hovering as the Spirit winds above the chaos waters that God will pull all creation out of. And then, next time we see Spirit, God is breathing life into every creature. So it's the breath that animates, the Spirit breath that animates every living thing. In fact, in the Hebrew Bible, pretty consistently, life is seen as beginning with breath. There's even this understanding that there is breath in blood, and in some places. Blood. Yeah. Which, scientifically we see the red blood cells. I don't think they had any way of knowing that, you know. But that's interesting still. Then we see the Spirit coming forth as this empowering agent sometimes in the tradition of Moses. That's certainly how Philo saw it. And then God's Spirit is traveling with the people. But your God has to have a house, right? Like, you want to make sure your God is comfortable. You want to at least honor them as a part of the community. So they build a tabernacle so that God could wander with them in the tabernacle. And sometimes God appears as fire during the night to guide them forward, and a cloud, a pillar of smoke to guide them during the day. Then one day, it's decided, well, you know, this tabernacle, it's just a tent, and we're in the promised land now, and we all live in houses. Surely God deserves a house. And who can argue with that? You get a house, surely God should get a house. So they make a house for God's Spirit to dwell in. They call the temple. But this isn't the only place that God dwells. God's Spirit would also rest or fill certain people to do important things. You have the warlords that rise up as Israel's deliverer heroes in the book of Judges. The most famous of one is Samson. He takes up the most chapters, but he's also a lot like Hercules, and, you know, there's just something really compelling about, like, a super strong character that can say Hulk smash, Samson smash, you know? And that super strength comes from God's Spirit. Now, he's super dumb in every other way. Like, Samson is not great. I mean, you know, hey. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. That's a good point. And I know some of you have felt like Samson, like, my strength is in my hair, don't you dare cut it. I get that. But that's not the only people that the Spirit rests within and fills and equips for special duties and tasks. God's Spirit also is seen as filling the kings. And these kings are also seen as children of God, sons of God. So David would have God's Spirit in him. Saul, who has a lot of problems, was filled with God's Spirit. You know, there's this sense, if you're an important leader in our community, God's Spirit is filling you and equipping you to lead us, to save us. And one of them also gets the superpowers. Solomon gets super wisdom, which, you know, is not as compelling as super strength, but sometimes you get kind of like a wily Bugs Bunny trickster stuff going on with him. That's kind of interesting sometimes. David, too, very much a Bugs Bunny type character. But the prophets also have God's Spirit with them because God speaks to them. And so they share these messages from God. You might be wondering where this is all going. In Isaiah 11, we get this passage that's really influential on the New Testament, in the New Testament, where Isaiah, after facing colonizing forces that are trying to take over his kingdom, tells of a day when a king will come, filled with God's Spirit, who will lead the people through justice and equity. He's a fair king, and will defeat enemies with words instead of weapons, and will bring about peace and harmony on earth. This is where the lion will lay down with the lamb image comes from. Can you imagine a world where we don't have predators? Can you imagine a world where we are not devouring other people or being devoured ourselves? And it's this image that echoes into the first century. And Jesus' followers seem to see him or hope that this will be him, which is part of why sometimes we have these passages that are like, and Jesus was very clear, he's not an earthly ruler, and that's not what he's about. John also likes this image, and he's pulling from it. He's like, but Jesus is going to be a spiritual king, because the book of John is really big on spirituality, really big on a spiritual reality beyond this one. And when he sees Jesus, he also has this hope of peace, of healing, of harmony. And who equips Jesus for this? It's God's Spirit. And while Jesus has this Spirit, he doesn't hoard it or keep it to himself. He doesn't use it as the kings of old would have. When you get to our passage, when he's resurrected and he appears to the disciples, instead of keeping it to himself, he shares it. He shares divinity with all of his followers in that room, which is a pretty special and wild thing to do. And in this moment, and as Christians will come to take this passage in the early church, we get this idea that we don't have kings here. Even Jesus, our spiritual king, tells us that he's our brother and our friend. He says in that Last Supper teaching that Todd read from, I'm not calling you servants anymore, not even students, you're friends. This is where the Quakers get their own name for themselves. They refer to themselves as friends of God. We get it from this passage. Jesus isn't relating to us in this top-down fashion, but rather right here with us. And you have God's Spirit, and you have God's Spirit. You are also representing God. God is with you too. God is not in a special fancy building. God is not with really important people. God's not with kings or would-be kings. God is not just with prophets and those we might deem as saints. God is here with you, filling you as close as the very breath in your lungs. And this takes on an additional nuance in Roman society, because you might remember, who is the Son of God to Rome? It's Caesar. He's the son of Jupiter. He's divine. He has a claim on divinity. He is bringing about peace, Pax Romana, through conquering, through Roman force. And here, Jesus is saying, no, your divinity too. You bear God with you. Peace and harmony is what the Spirit's leading us towards, and we share it together and are working towards it together. The word called advocate in the translation that Todd read is an interesting one. It's paracletes, and it means literally come alongside her, which is not a word we have in our language, and it's really tricky to pin down. So sometimes it gets translated as advocate, which is great for some of the lawyers in our midst, right? You know? Sometimes it's counselor. Sometimes it's comforter. It's hard to define it. But it's this idea that God's Spirit not only fills us, but like accompanies us. God is walking with you. You know, the paraclete is coming alongside you. In process theology, there's this idea that because God is inherently a relational being and is present with all of us, that God shares our best moments, our joys with us, but God also shares our worst moments, those horrible pain points we experience. And so, as was read, God is the fellow sufferer who understands. And I don't know about you, but sometimes I just need to know that someone else understands me. It's a messy place in here, you know? Sometimes I need to know that God has been going through this with me too. I'm not alone in my struggles. You're not alone in your struggles. God partners with us. We encounter God all the time because God lives with us. John believes that God's Spirit is with all of those following Christ, but I'm going to tell you, I kind of have a bone to pick with him here. I like to piggyback on this idea in Genesis that God's Spirit animates everything, right? And this other idea in 1 John, that God not only is loving, that God not only created love, but that God is love itself. That's precious to me. And from that, I believe that God is with all of us, each one of us, and seeks for healing. Now, this last week was a real spectacle in Christian nationalism. I don't know if any of you saw the special readings of various far-right pastors and some of our civic leaders. Christian nationalism continues to gain a stronger and stronger foothold in this country. It's becoming one of the most visible, dominant forms of Christianity. And it has the support of would-be Caesars. They want us to think that God is with them and against us and our neighbors. But Jesus carried a hope of peace and harmony, a world made right. And Jesus shared God's spirit of love, connecting us as family of God. I pity those who worship the God of power, because it feasts not only on us, but it feasts on them too. It devours them as well. And while we may fall victims to their schemes from time to time, they cannot take our divine companion from us. As the web of life, she knits us to one another. She guides us in pursuit of love and peace, not just for some of us, but for all of us. And when doing the right thing conflicts with our fear, she gives us courage. And as she walks alongside us, she sustains us with peace and hope and integrity. Our Christian nationalist neighbors could know this spirit. She walks alongside them too, calling out to them, inviting them to something better. They could know such love and peace and hope and integrity. At my old church, I learned that one of our teens, this isn't Waverly Old Church, this was back when I was an evangelical youth pastor shortly after, one of our teens got pregnant. And one of our leaders said, "Hey, she's one of your kids. How are we going to have any kind of clout here morally if you don't kick her out?" You know, we have to practice what we preach. She has strayed. That's not just bad news for that young woman. It is devastating news for her, but it's not just bad news for her. Imagine being a parent making that choice. That's bad news for the parent too. That's bad news for that community. That's bad news for everybody. It's the girl who can see that it's bad for her because she's the most affected by it. We don't have to live that way. And our friends and our family members and our neighbors who do, it's poisonous to them too. Perhaps one day they will be freed from this insatiable hunger for power. Perhaps we will be freed from the ramifications of it. In the meantime, let us continue to work for a world of peace and harmony and love and integrity.